There are battles you never saw, wars that unfolded while your body rested and your mind tried to recover, attacks that were cancelled before they ever reached your door, threats dissolved before they could take form, outcomes rewritten in realms you cannot see but deeply feel, and chosen, one. The reason your life feels unusually quiet right now is not because nothing is happening, but because something loud, aggressive, and destructive was defeated in the spiritual realm on your behalf. Something that was designed to overwhelm you, consume you, and end your forward motion before it ever began. And the enemy truly believed this was the moment you would finally break, because he studied your history, he analyzed your wounds, he memorized your disappointments, he calculated your losses, and he assumed that isolation would weaken you, that silence would hollow you out, that being alone would make you doubt your calling. But instead, something unexpected happened, something that shifted authority itself, because your silence became discipline, your loneliness became insulation, your stillness became clarity, and your endurance became a force that could not be negotiated with. And when you refused to self-destruct, when you chose restraint over retaliation, when you did not return evil for evil, when you did not abandon your faith in the dark moments where no one would have blamed you for doing so, you forced the enemy into a position he never planned for. You forced him to kneel. Yes, kneel, because there is nothing more threatening to darkness than a soul that suffers without surrendering its integrity. And in that moment, something rare occurred, something that echoed through the spiritual order, because God expected obedience. The enemy expected collapse. But neither expected this level of inner strength, this level of restraint, this level of quiet mastery. And now you're wondering why the world around you feels empty, why people vanished without closure, why invitations stopped coming, why relationships faded without explanation, why familiar energies no longer have access to you, but chosen one. This is not rejection. This is divine protection. This is the narrowing of your environment to preserve your assignment. This is God removing noise so you can hear instruction. This is separation before elevation. And before we go deeper, I want you to anchor this truth. Comment, I am chosen. If this message resonates with your spirit, like this video so this word reaches others walking this same narrow path, and subscribe because this channel speaks truth for those marked for purpose. Now take a breath, center yourself, feel the stillness that proves the battle was won. Now let's go deeper. Point 1. Why the loneliness began before you understood it. Chosen one. The loneliness did not begin when people left. It began earlier, in the quiet and almost unnoticeable moment when your inner frequency started changing before your outer life could keep up. Long before separation showed up in faces, messages, or empty spaces, it showed up internally. You stopped resonating with shallow conversations that once passed the time. You felt a subtle irritation where there used to be tolerance, a fatigue after certain interactions that once felt effortless. Places that used to feel familiar began to feel loud, heavy, or strangely draining. This is always the first sign, and it is never random. Before God removes people from your physical life, He removes compatibility from your inner world. Loneliness is not a sudden punishment or a mistake in your path. It is a gradual misalignment designed to protect what you are becoming. The reason it feels confusing is because nothing bad happened on the surface. There was no dramatic betrayal to point to, no obvious conflict to justify the distance, and no villain to blame. There was only a quiet pulling apart, a gentle loosening of emotional threads. This is how divine protection works at higher levels. Loud removals create shock, chaos, and unnecessary trauma. Quiet distancing preserves your nervous system, your clarity, and your peace. God does not need destruction to separate what no longer belongs together. He simply allows resonance to fade. When you were still fragile, still forming, still learning how to trust yourself, He allowed companionship so you would not break under the weight of becoming. When you grew stronger, more anchored, and more internally guided, He allowed solitude so you could hear your own soul without interference. This is not regression, and it is not a step backward. This is refinement. Loneliness feels heavy because your soul is recalibrating to walk without external validation, applause, or constant reflection from others. You are learning how to stand without leaning, how to listen without noise, and how to move without needing permission or agreement. That discomfort is not abandonment. It is conditioning. You are being trained to remain whole even when no one is watching, to remain steady without reinforcement, and to trust the quiet authority forming inside you. This phase is not here to break you. It is here to stabilize you. When companionship returns, it will not be to complete you, but to walk beside someone who no longer needs to be held up. Point 2. The psychological reason the enemy lost access to you. The enemy never attacks strength directly because raw strength offers no leverage. Instead, he studies patterns, observes timing, memorizes reactions, and waits for the moment when repetition becomes predictability. He watches emotional loops the way a strategist studies supply lines, knowing that what repeats can be intercepted, drained, and redirected. For a long time, people and situations had reliable access to you, not because they were more powerful, but because you responded the same way every time. You explained yourself when misunderstood. You defended your intentions when questioned. You overgave when ignored. You overthought when dismissed. Each reaction created a familiar rhythm, and familiarity is fuel for manipulation. But something shifted, quietly and without announcement. You stopped chasing clarity from those committed to confusion. You stopped begging to be understood by those who benefited from misunderstanding you. You stopped bleeding outward and stopped leaking energy through justification and emotional labor. This sudden absence of reaction disrupted the system that once fed on your predictability. Silence in this context is not weakness, and it is not surrender. Silence is adaptive withdrawal, a strategic refusal to supply what is being extracted. When you stopped reacting, the psychological hook dissolved because there was nothing left to catch. The enemy cannot manipulate what he cannot provoke, and provocation only works when there is a guaranteed response. When provocation failed, intimidation failed, because intimidation requires fear, and fear requires engagement. When intimidation failed, access was revoked, not by force, but by irrelevance. This is why attacks did not escalate. They thinned out, lost intensity, and began to feel distant, confused, and almost clumsy. The battle did not intensify because it did not need to. The loop had already been exited. What once felt like pressure now feels like background noise because the channel has been closed. The kneeling did not happen through confrontation or domination, but through non-participation, through the quiet realization that you are no longer available for the role assigned to you. You did not defeat darkness by fighting it on its terms. You rendered it ineffective by outgrowing its reach, by becoming unpredictable, unavailable, and internally anchored. What could once pull you now cannot even find you, and that is the deepest form of power there is. Point 3. Why God hid you instead of rewarding you publicly. Many believe obedience leads immediately to visibility, that the moment alignment occurs, recognition must follow, but that assumption misunderstands how divine systems actually function. Visibility without stabilization does not reward the chosen one. It fractures them. God does not elevate what is still integrating, because elevation amplifies everything that exists beneath the surface. You were hidden not because you failed, not because you were forgotten, but because your inner architecture was evolving faster than your external environment could safely support. Transformation was happening at a structural level: beliefs, nervous system, identity, perception, and premature exposure would have placed weight on a frame still reinforcing itself. Public recognition too early creates pressure before capacity, expectation before embodiment, and demand before mastery. God values sustainability over speed, depth over display, and longevity over applause. This season of concealment was not punishment. It was protection. You were hidden to allow your nervous system to recalibrate after prolonged stress, disappointment, and spiritual stretching. You were hidden so your sense of self could detach from approval, so your worth could exist without witnesses, validation, or applause. When affirmation is removed, what remains is truth. This quiet season feels uncomfortable because it strips away performance-based identity. There is no audience to impress, no feedback loop to lean on, and no external mirror telling you who you are. That silence is intentional. Applause at this stage would have distracted you from integration, from becoming whole rather than impressive. You are being trained to exist without performing, to stand without explaining, and to know without being seen. This is where emotional independence forms, where spiritual authority matures, and where identity roots itself internally instead of externally. When God hides you, it is because what he is building must survive noise later. Noise tests stability, attention tests humility, visibility tests grounding. Only what is anchored can withstand exposure without losing itself. This is not a delay. Delay implies resistance or error. This is insulation. Insulation protects what is still regulating its temperature. It preserves strength until the environment can no longer destabilize it. You're not behind, you're being fortified. When the time for visibility arrives, it will not overwhelm you, because you will not need it to feel real. You will enter it whole, steady, and unshaken, carrying an identity that was forged in silence, and therefore cannot be undone by noise. Point 4. Why relationships fell away without explanation. Not everyone exits loudly. Some leave silently because their purpose in your life has expired, not out of cruelty, but out of order. There are departures that do not come with arguments, explanations, or final conversations, because the ending itself is not meant to be processed through logic. Closure is not always mutual, and it is not always verbal. Some connections are seasonal by design, assigned to you for a specific chapter, a specific lesson, or a specific version of who you once were. When the lesson completes, emotional access ends without negotiation, without ceremony, and without apology. You felt confused because you expected communication, but the separation was spiritual, not conversational. You were waiting for words, while the universe was applying alignment. God does not owe explanations to every attachment, especially the ones that would delay your obedience or weaken your discernment. Some people cannot hear the reason without resisting it, reframing it, or attempting to bargain with it. So distance becomes the message. Silence becomes the boundary. Absence becomes the instruction. The loneliness hurts because you are wired for connection, because the human soul longs to be seen and mirrored. But the separation is protective because those connections could not follow you where you are going. They were calibrated for who you were, not who you are becoming. If they stayed, you would have shrunk to keep them comfortable. If they had stayed, you would have muted your growth to preserve familiarity. Not everyone who loves you is meant to walk with you, and not everyone who walks with you loves you. Some remain close out of habit, access, or convenience, not alignment. Others love you deeply but are only permitted to love you from a distance, because proximity would distort both of you. This is why discernment grows when companionship decreases. Fewer voices sharpen your hearing. Fewer influences clarify your direction. Solitude is not punishment here. It is refinement. It is the quiet where intuition becomes louder than approval. It is the space where you learn to self-soothe without self-betrayal. You are not being abandoned. You are being reassigned. You are not losing people. You are losing friction. What feels like rejection is often redirection operating without your consent. Trust that what left did so because it could not survive the altitude you are being prepared for. Trust that what remains will meet you there without resistance. And trust that the silence you are sitting in now is not empty. It is filled with recalibration, protection, and a deeper intimacy with truth than noise ever allowed. Point 5. The hidden strength being built in this isolation. Isolation strips illusion in a way nothing else can. When the noise of constant interaction fades, there is nowhere for borrowed identities to hide. You begin to hear your own thoughts clearly, not the echo of opinions you absorbed to survive, belong, or be approved of. In that silence, you notice where your identity was quietly outsourced, where choices were shaped by expectation rather than conviction, and where validation replaced self-trust without you realizing it. This realization is deeply uncomfortable because it exposes dependency patterns that once felt like personality. You see how certain reactions were trained responses, how certain attachments were emotional crutches, and how certain versions of yourself were performances refined over time. The discomfort is not punishment. It is revelation. It is the nervous system adjusting to self-authorship. This is where authority is formed, not the kind that demands attention, but the kind that no longer needs permission. True authority is not loud or forceful. It is settled. It does not rush to explain itself or seek agreement. It stands quietly because it knows where it stands. This is why you feel calmer and heavier at the same time. Calm because the inner noise is reducing. Heavy because your emotional center is recalibrating, shedding excess reactions, old defenses, and borrowed urgency. You are no longer reactive, but you are not numb either. You are grounded. Grounded means you feel more, not less, but you are no longer controlled by what you feel. That grounded state can feel unfamiliar because chaos once felt normal. Instability trained your nervous system to associate intensity with aliveness, urgency with purpose, and constant movement with safety. When that pattern dissolves, peace can initially feel empty. Not empty as in lacking, but empty as in quiet, open and undefined. The mind, conditioned by noise, mistakes this openness for absence, but this emptiness is not lack. It is space. Space to think without interruption. Space to feel without distortion. Space to decide without pressure. Space is where alignment forms and direction clarifies. Nothing expands while compressed. Nothing matures while crowded. This is why isolation often precedes growth. It clears the internal landscape so something truer can take root. What feels like loss is actually subtraction. What feels like stillness is actually stabilization. And what feels like emptiness is the exact condition required for expansion, integration, and the emergence of a self that no longer needs to be constructed in reaction to the world, but can finally stand in quiet, unshakable coherence. Point 6. Why this season is ending. Old versions of you permanently. This phase is not meant to repeat, it is meant to conclude, and that distinction is what gives the stillness you feel its quiet authority. Something has finished forming inside you, not loudly, not with ceremony, but with a finality that does not ask for permission. Once integration completes, you do not return to old dynamics because the internal architecture that once fit them no longer exists. You do not renegotiate expired roles because the person who needed validation from those roles has already dissolved. You do not explain your growth because growth that must be explained is still asking to be approved. Instead, you simply move differently, and that difference speaks in ways language never could. This is why nostalgia feels weaker now. You remember the moments, the faces, and the emotional climates, but you no longer ache for them. The charge has been removed. The memory remains, yet the nervous system no longer reaches back for completion. That is emotional closure without conversation, the kind that happens when the lesson has been fully absorbed rather than intellectually understood. When God ends a chapter, He seals it internally first, long before the external world reflects the change. This is why the outer circumstances may look unchanged while your inner response has shifted completely. The silence you feel is not emptiness, it is resolution. It is the sound of a system no longer leaking energy into places that cannot receive it. You are not being prepared to go back into old rooms with new strength, because that would still center the past as relevant. You are being prepared to enter new rooms without old wounds, without reflexive defenses, and without the need to prove how far you've come. This preparation is subtle and often misunderstood because it looks like withdrawal, but it is actually refinement. Layers are being removed, not added. Attachments are loosening, not because you failed to care, but because you learned how to care without self-abandonment. This is elevation through subtraction, the quiet mathematics of spiritual maturity, where less reaction creates more authority and fewer explanations create greater clarity. You are not losing people, timelines, or identities. You are losing distortions. What remains is not heavier, but lighter, not louder, but truer. And as this internal seal completes, the external world will eventually reorganize around it. Not because you forced change, but because alignment always follows integration. Point 7. What comes after the protection phase? After protection comes alignment, not crowds, not noise, not distraction, but alignment, the quiet recalibration of your inner world, where everything unnecessary falls away and only what is true remains. You will notice that fewer people can reach you now, yet the ones who do arrive with clarity, fewer opportunities present themselves, yet the ones that remain are clean, precise, and free of hidden costs. The loneliness does not end with chaos or stimulation, but with resonance, a deep internal recognition that feels calm rather than intoxicating. You begin to recognize connection not by intensity, but by peace. You understand purpose not by urgency, but by steadiness. This is the reward for endurance, because what you thought was loss was actually refinement. You did not lose people. You lost interference. You did not miss out. You were preserved, and because you survived the quiet without collapsing into doubt, distraction, or desperation, You proved you could be trusted with what comes next. This season did not weaken you, it clarified you, and clarity is power. It sharpens your discernment, stabilizes your emotions, and anchors your spirit. If you are still here, it is because this message was meant for you. You were not ignored, not forgotten, not rejected. You were shielded. The enemy knows it. That is why he stepped back. Stand firm, stay grounded, move slowly, remain inwardly anchored, and never doubt what heaven has already confirmed. You are chosen.